What if I told you that some of the most important foods in the Bible have almost completely disappeared from the modern table? Most people recognize the familiar ones: bread, fish, olive oil, grapes, honey. But hidden between them are foods that fed prophets, sustained exhausted soldiers, and helped whole households survive difficult seasons. Foods that could be stored for months, survive desert heat, and travel without refrigeration. And foods most people today have either never tasted or would not recognize. While we fill our kitchens with refined flour and packaged snacks, the biblical world ran on a completely different food system. They roasted grain instead of milling everything into white flour. They pressed fruit into dense survival cakes. They ate grains modern agriculture abandoned. And in some cases, they ate things most people today would struggle to put anywhere near their mouths. These foods were not all miraculous medicines, and the Bible was not written as a modern nutrition manual. But it recorded the real eating habits of people living through famine, migration, war, exile, harvest, and wilderness survival. Today we are uncovering 12 of them. Stay with us, because number 5 appears in one of Jesus' most famous parables, yet most people have no idea what the food actually was. Number 8 was given to a man who had gone 3 days without food or water, and the Bible says that after eating it, his strength returned. And number 11 is a creature the law specifically permitted as food, and John the Baptist may have depended on it while surviving in the wilderness. One important note before we begin: forgotten does not automatically mean better, and biblical does not automatically mean safe for everyone. Some of these foods require proper preparation, several can trigger allergies or medical problems, and one should never be gathered from the wild without expert identification. With that understood, let us begin. Number 1. Parched grain, the snack that existed before packaged food. Let us start with something so ordinary that people ate it directly in the middle of a field: parched grain. In Ruth chapter 2, Ruth spends the day gathering leftover barley behind the harvesters. At mealtime, Boaz invites her to sit with the workers. He gives her bread to dip in wine vinegar, and then he passes her roasted grain. It sounds simple because it was simple. Grain was harvested while still slightly moist, roasted over heat, rubbed to remove the husk, and eaten without grinding or baking. Dry, nutty, portable, ready to eat. This was the biblical world's version of a trail snack. Parched grain also appears in the supplies Abigail hurriedly gathered for David and his men. She had no time for a banquet. She needed food that could be loaded onto animals immediately and eaten without further cooking. Here is what makes it important. We often imagine ancient people eating bread at every meal, but turning grain into bread required grinding, water, kneading, fuel, and time. Parched grain removed most of those steps. It preserved the whole kernel while making it easier to chew and store. We still roast corn, rice, oats, and chickpeas, but few people sit down with a bowl of freshly roasted barley. The method disappeared as milling got easier and packaged snacks took over. But ancient people understood something. Convenience made us forget. Sometimes the simplest way to eat a grain is to disturb it as little as possible. Just grain, heat, and hunger. Number 2. Fava beans, the wilderness protein. That came with a warning. When David fled Jerusalem during Absalom's rebellion, he and his followers reached the wilderness exhausted, thirsty, and hungry. Supporters brought them wheat, barley, roasted grain, lentils, curds, cheese, and beans. These were probably broad beans, also called fava beans, one of the oldest cultivated legumes in the Mediterranean world. And they were not a vegetable beside the meal. They were the meal. Dried beans stored through poor harvests, traveled on long journeys, and cooked into thick stews. They supplied plant protein, carbohydrates, fiber, and minerals in a world where meat was not on the table every night. Grain provided much of the day's energy, but beans made the meal more sustaining. Combined with bread or another grain, they created a more balanced source of amino acids than either food provided alone. Modern kitchens still use kidney beans and chickpeas, but fava beans remain unfamiliar outside the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia and Europe. They take more effort. Mature beans may need soaking, cooking, and skinning. But here is the warning. Fava beans can cause a dangerous reaction called favism in people with glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, or G6PD deficiency. In susceptible individuals, compounds in the beans can trigger the rapid destruction of red blood cells. People who know they have G6PD deficiency are generally advised to avoid them. This is exactly why biblical food should never be treated as a guarantee of universal safety. For most people, properly prepared fava beans are simply an old and nutritious legume. For others, they are dangerous. Number 3. Millet, the grain built for difficult years. Millet appears in one of the Bible's strangest bread instructions. In Ezekiel 4, the prophet is told to combine wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and another ancient grain in one container and bake bread from the mixture. This was not a luxury recipe. It was a picture of scarcity. When preferred ingredients ran short, people combined whatever remained in storage. A little barley, some millet, beans or lentils. Mixed together, those fragments became survival bread. And millet was built for that kind of world. Unlike crops that demand rich soil and steady rain, many millets grow fast and tolerate dry conditions. The grains are tiny, but the plant's ability to survive heat and uncertain rainfall made it enormously valuable. Millet is still eaten by millions across Africa and Asia, but it has almost vanished from Western kitchens. Where wheat, rice, and corn dominate every shelf, millet is often treated as birdseed rather than human food. That would have seemed strange to ancient farmers. Cooked millet can be prepared like porridge, rice, or couscous. Ground millet can be used in flatbreads and mixed-grain loaves. It is naturally gluten-free, though anyone with celiac disease still needs products protected from cross-contamination during farming and processing. Millet also contains fiber, minerals, and plant compounds, but its greatest strength may have been reliability. It grew where other grains struggled, and it stored well. Millet was not the grain people dreamed about during a feast. It was the grain they were grateful to find when the rain failed. Number 4. Spelt and emmer, the wheat that came before modern bread. The final grain named in Ezekiel's mixed bread is often translated as spelt, although scholars have debated the precise ancient species behind the Hebrew word. It may have referred to emmer, spelt, or a related hulled wheat. Whatever the identification, it was not the standardized bread wheat filling modern supermarkets. Ancient wheat grew inside a protective hull that clung tightly to the grain. Farmers could not simply thresh it and send it to a mill. The hull had to be removed before the grain could be ground. That extra labor became one reason hulled wheats declined. Modern bread wheat was easier to process at industrial scale, easier to breed for yield, and better suited to the soft dough large bakeries expected. Ancient wheat never vanished completely, but it moved to the edge of agriculture. Today, einkorn, emmer, and spelt are returning as specialty grains. They can contain useful levels of protein, fiber, and minerals, but the differences depend heavily on variety, soil, milling method, and whether the whole grain or refined flour is used. And here's a correction missing from most videos on this subject. Ancient wheat still contains gluten. Spelt, einkorn, and emmer are not safe substitutes for people with celiac disease merely because they are old. Some people may prefer their flavor or tolerate certain products differently, but age does not remove gluten. The lesson is not that ancient wheat was magically perfect. It is that wheat once came in many forms. Modern agriculture gave us enormous quantities of a few varieties. The biblical world depended on diversity because it increased the chance that something would survive. Food security is not only about producing more, sometimes it is about refusing to depend on one crop. Number 5. Carob pods, the famine food, hidden in a famous parable. In Jesus' parable of the prodigal son, a young man demands his inheritance, leaves home, wastes everything, and ends up feeding pigs during a famine. He becomes so hungry he longs to eat the pods given to the animals. Many translations simply call them pods. Others identify them as carob pods. Carob comes from an evergreen Mediterranean tree that produces long, dark brown fruit. When ripe and dried, the pods contain a sweet pulp surrounding extremely hard seeds. Today, carob powder is sometimes sold as an alternative to cocoa. But in the ancient world, the pod was not pretending to be chocolate. It was its own food. The pulp could be chewed, ground into flour, boiled into syrup, or fed to livestock. It contained natural sugar and substantial fiber, and the tree survived dry conditions. But the prodigal son's desire for the pods is not presented as a health trend. It is humiliation. He had left a household with bread to spare and fallen so far that the animals appeared better fed than he was. The carob pod is the parable's lowest point, the moment before he decides to go home. And yet the food was real. Carob is still cultivated around the Mediterranean, and its seeds still shape modern food. Locust bean gum, a thickener used in sauces, dairy, and desserts, comes from carob seeds. Many people eat part of this forgotten biblical food without realizing it. The pod that symbolized desperation in a parable now hides inside ingredient labels. Animal feed, human food, famine food, sweetener, thickener. And one of the most recognizable stories Jesus ever told cannot be fully imagined without it. Number 6. Sycamore figs, the poor person's fruit, grown by a prophet. When Amos was challenged about his authority to speak, he explained that he had not begun as a professional prophet. He had been a herdsman and a worker among sycamore fig trees. The sycamore fig of the Bible is not the tree most English speakers call a sycamore. It belongs to the fig family and produces clusters of small fruit directly from the trunk and older branches. But this fruit had a problem. It did not always ripen properly without human help. Workers cut or pierced the developing fruit to encourage it to mature. This may be what Amos meant. He was not standing beneath a tree waiting for figs to fall. He was doing skilled agricultural work. Sycamore figs were considered less desirable than common figs, smaller, less sweet, associated with ordinary people. But the trees produced heavily and thrived in warm regions, which made them dependable. A luxury fruit might command a high price. A sycamore fig fed families who could not afford luxury. The fruit is still consumed in parts of Africa and the Middle East, but it has largely disappeared from international agriculture. Modern research on it is also far more limited than research on the common fig, and perhaps that is why it belongs here. The Bible does not only preserve the foods of kings, it preserves the fruit handled by laborers, the tree that required someone to touch each piece and help it ripen. Before Amos carried a message to a nation, he worked with food most powerful people considered beneath them. Number 7. Raisin cakes. The ancient world's portable energy food raisins are still common. Raisin cakes are not. When Abigail rushed to stop David from taking revenge against her household, she gathered an enormous supply of food: bread, wine, prepared sheep, roasted grain, fig cakes, and 100 cakes of raisins. These were not cakes in the modern sense. No frosting, no refined flour. The raisins were crushed and pressed into dense blocks, easier to stack, carry, and divide. Drying grapes removes most of their water and concentrates the natural sugars, making raisins lighter, slower to spoil, and useful as rapid energy during labor or travel. Imagine moving fresh grapes through desert heat. They split, ferment, leak, attract insects. A dense raisin cake could be wrapped, loaded onto a donkey, and opened when needed. That is why dried fruit appears repeatedly in stories involving journeys, armies, gifts, and emergency provisions. Modern people recreated the same idea and gave it a different name: the energy bar. We mix dried fruit with nuts and oats and wrap it in shiny plastic. Ancient households pressed fruit into portable blocks without a factory. Of course, dried fruit is concentrated in sugar as well as energy, so portions matter, especially for people managing blood glucose. But that concentration was exactly what made it valuable to someone walking for hours or recovering from hunger. Raisin cakes were not desserts. They were compact food technology, a vineyard turned into something that could travel. Number 8. Pressed fig cakes, the food that revived a starving man. Now the food that restored a man after 3 days without food or water. In 1 Samuel 30, David and his men find an Egyptian servant abandoned in the countryside. He is weak, dehydrated, and unable to continue. They give him water, bread, part of a pressed fig cake, and raisins. After he eats, the text says, his strength returns. This is not described as a miracle. It is described as feeding a starving person. Fresh figs are soft and highly perishable. Once ripe, they must be eaten, dried, or processed quickly. Ancient people solved that by drying the fruit and pressing it into cakes. A fig cake concentrated carbohydrates into a smaller space while preserving some fiber and minerals. It could be carried on campaign, stored for emergencies, broken into pieces, and softened with water. What David's men gave him was essentially a careful recovery meal. First water, then bread and concentrated fruit. They did not interrogate him while he was collapsing. They restored him before asking him to speak. That detail matters. The man later provides the information that helps David find the raiding party. The person others discarded becomes essential when someone feeds him. Pressed fig cakes appear repeatedly in biblical supply lists, but few people make them today. The original was far simpler than anything we buy. Dried fruit compressed into portable survival food, and it carries one of the strongest food lessons in Scripture. Sometimes the person who appears useless is not useless. He is hungry. Feed him first, and his strength may return. 8 foods in, and a pattern is appearing. No refrigeration, no plastic, no supermarket open all night. People survive by removing moisture, roasting grain, fermenting milk, and turning seasonal abundance into food that could last. They could not stop every famine, but they became extraordinarily skilled at making food travel through time. Number 9, goat's milk and curds, the dairy food built for rocky land. When modern people hear the word milk, they picture a cow. Biblical households pictured a goat. Proverbs describes having enough goat's milk to feed a household. Curds, milk, and cheese appear throughout stories of hospitality, travel, and wilderness provision. Goats were extremely useful in dry, mountainous country. They browsed shrubs cattle ignored, needed less space, and gave milk that could be drunk fresh or turned into something longer lasting. But without refrigeration, fresh milk was difficult to keep. So people fermented it. Natural bacteria converted part of the lactose into lactic acid, thickening the milk into something like yogurt, curds, or soft cheese. The exact products varied by region, season, and household method. Fermentation was not about flavor. It extended the useful life of the milk. A bowl of curds outlasted fresh milk, and a drained or salted cheese lasted longer still, letting families carry one milking into the following days. Goat dairy is still common in many regions, but most consumers in industrialized countries rarely drink it. Cow dairy scaled more easily, and its milder flavor became the standard. Goat's milk has smaller average fat globules and a protein profile different from cow's milk, but it still contains lactose and milk proteins. It is not automatically safe for someone with a dairy allergy, and raw milk can carry dangerous pathogens. Modern versions should be properly pasteurized. The lesson is not that everyone should replace cow's milk. It is that biblical dairy was a complete system. The animal grazed difficult land. The milk fed the family. Fermentation extended its life. Almost nothing was wasted because every drop required work. Number 10. Bitter herbs. The food designed to be unpleasant. Most foods are prepared to taste better. The bitter herbs of Passover were eaten partly because they tasted worse. In Exodus chapter 12, the Israelites are instructed to eat the Passover meal with roasted meat, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. Scripture does not clearly identify one single plant species. Later traditions used herbs such as lettuce, endive, chicory, or horseradish. But the biblical phrase itself is broader. The bitterness carried memory. The meal marked Israel's deliverance from slavery, and the unpleasant taste represented the harshness of bondage. Modern eating culture struggles with this. We expect bitterness to be removed. Manufacturers breed vegetables for mildness, add sugar to sauces, and cover strong flavors with salt. But the Passover meal deliberately preserved discomfort. It asked the body to remember something the mind might try to soften. Bitter plants had culinary value too, providing contrast against roasted meat and flatbread, and many leafy, bitter herbs supplied fiber and micronutrients. But reducing them to nutrition misses the purpose. They were edible history. Every generation could hear the story, but they also had to taste it. People still eat lettuce and chicory, and Jewish families still use maror at Passover. What has become rare is the idea of deliberately placing an unpleasant flavor at the center of a meal, because remembrance matters more than comfort. The Bible understood that taste can carry meaning. Sweetness celebrates, salt preserves, and bitterness refuses to let suffering become abstract. Number 11. Locusts, the biblical protein. Most people refuse to try. This may be the most uncomfortable food on the list. Locusts. Leviticus names certain kinds of locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers among the insects Israelites were permitted to eat. Centuries later, the Gospels describe John the Baptist living in the wilderness and eating locusts and wild honey. Some people have tried to reinterpret the word locusts as the pods of the carob tree. But the ordinary reading of the Gospel text is that John ate insects, following a food practice known in the region. And this was not as strange then as it sounds now. Locust swarms destroyed crops, but the insects could be collected, roasted, dried, salted, or ground. Part of the disaster became food. Edible insects can provide substantial protein, fat, and micronutrients, although their composition varies by species, life stage, diet, and preparation. They are still eaten in many cultures today. The resistance is cultural more than biological. Many people disgusted by a roasted locust will happily eat shrimp, crab, or lobster, animals with segmented bodies, shells, and multiple legs. One lives on land, the others in water. But caution matters. Wild insects may be contaminated by pesticides, parasites, bacteria, fungi, or heavy metals. Edible insects can also trigger allergic reactions, particularly in people allergic to shellfish, dust mites, or related proteins. They should come from regulated food producers and be properly processed. John the Baptist was not following a sustainability trend. He was living on what a harsh environment provided. Wild honey gave rapid energy. Locusts supplied protein and fat, and together they required almost no farmland. The creature modern people try to eliminate may once have helped a prophet survive. Number 12. Quail, the food that arrived as both provision and warning. And finally, quail. When the Israelites traveled through the wilderness, the Bible describes quail arriving around the camp. To modern readers, this sounds impossible. But quail are migratory, and large exhausted groups descend during seasonal movement. Birds flying long distances land low and become easier to capture. Quail mattered because they provided meat, where livestock could not simply be slaughtered whenever people complained of hunger. But the quail stories carry two very different tones. In Exodus, quail are provision. In Numbers, the demand for meat becomes a darker story about craving, dissatisfaction, and judgment, which is why quail cannot be reduced to another forgotten superfood. The food was not the problem. The attitude around it was. They had received provision, but their desire became contempt for what they already had. Quail are still eaten, but far less than chicken. The birds are small, and industrial farming favors animals that grow fast and yield more. In the biblical world, a small bird could mean the difference between eating meat and having none. Food can be provision without becoming entitlement. It can be received with gratitude or consumed with endless dissatisfaction. The wilderness generation saw birds covering the ground and still had to decide what the meal meant. That is why quail belongs at number 12. Not because it was the rarest food, but because it reveals that hunger is not always located in the stomach. 12 foods and a biblical world that looked nothing like a modern kitchen. Grain roasted straight from the harvest, fruit pressed into cakes that could travel for days, milk fermented because fresh milk would not wait, herbs eaten bitter on purpose to preserve memory. Some disappeared because better alternatives arrived. Others vanished because industrial agriculture demanded crops that could be planted, harvested, and sold at enormous scale. And a few never disappeared at all. They remain in traditional kitchens and regional markets while the rest of the world calls them forgotten. But the most important lesson is not that we should copy every ancient meal. It is that these people understood food as more than entertainment. A cake of pressed figs could restore an abandoned servant. A bowl of roasted grain could welcome a poor woman into the harvester's circle. Bitter herbs could carry the memory of slavery across generations. So which of these surprised you the most? Would you try roasted barley, carob pods, millet bread, goat curds, or even properly prepared locusts? Tell us in the comments. And remember this the next time you read a biblical story involving food. The meal is rarely just background. Sometimes the food tells you who is poor, who is traveling, who is desperate, who is generous, and who has forgotten to be grateful.